Good morning, beautiful people of DARIAH. It's really a pleasure to be here to kick off the conference. Toma, that was wonderful. I thought partway through your remarks, please stop talking because that's all the stuff that I'm going to say. So workflows is such a wonderful and timely theme, and I'm so glad that we're gathering to talk about it for the next couple of days. I wish that I could go to every panel. The two streams are going to be painful this time. So Toma, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to the organizing committee, Danielle, for all of your work. Kim, who exudes competence. Be careful with that. That is going to get you into trouble. And just everyone with the DARIAH team. We look over at DARIAH. The CDH was the first US collaborator with a member of, what are we called? Cooperating partner. And we were so proud because you guys are everything we need in the States, an actual infrastructure. And even what the dean was saying, it's so important now that we talk across universities to make sure that what we do is recognized. So I'm going to not answer the question really of why humanists don't think about what they do as data, but I'm going to think a little about why, or kind of pontificate, meditate on why we get so worked up about that and why it's such a topic of controversy. Zoe and I are still in the process of writing the book, so we don't have an answer yet, but forthcoming. So just to get started, I dream about workflows. Natasha knows this is true. I have a little private Slack channel with her where I say, you're not going to believe what I dreamed last night. Maybe this will work. And what I mean is I dream about relationships, as we all do, right? So I want to suggest or think about today how workflows are both relationships and a way that we try to avoid some of the messiness and nuance of relationships when it's important to do that. Some of the feelings and emotions that we sometimes wish we could avoid when we're in our working lives, I think we sometimes think, oh, workflows are going to take care of that. If we just have a workflow, we can maybe move past some of the worked upness that we're feeling about disagreements or controversies across divisions and disciplines and divides. And I'm going to unfortunately suggest that's not really the case, that we have to think about emotion and we have to think about our feelings and our situatedness and our differences as we're building the workflows and actually take that process of processing our emotions into account as part of our process. So I chose images here from one of my favorite artists. Her name is Meredith, and she lives in Seville. And I chose these to guide me through the presentation, first because I knew I would be jet lagged and tired, and also because her images are just really comforting to me. And I'm not posing solutions, and so I thought maybe they would be comforting to you also about how worked up we get about data in the humanities, but trying to just foreground that discomfort and to think about how we might process these emotions together if you feel them too. So I hope you're okay with a lot of colors and a lot of images because they're intended to keep me awake, and I hope they also keep you distracted because I tend to ramble. So I just wrote a book called Poetry's Data. It used to be called Prosody as Archive, and then I realized, oh, if I have archive in the title, they're going to come for me because archivists are fierce. Talk about worked up, right? I knew what I was getting into with that title, and I decided I would change it. Not that data is any less controversial, but after this trip, I will continue to write with Zoe LeBlanc at the University of Illinois-Champaign, another book called Data Work in the Humanities. And both of these books were the result of me being worked up about data in some way. So I was trying to think about both of these things and the emotions around them because as the result of trying to write Poetry's Data, well, actually before Poetry's Data, I was trying to build an archive and trying to build an archive, which was not an archive, which was a database, which is how I know that archivists will come for you. I had to build a Center for Digital Humanities. And so this is also the story of me sort of being frustrated with the idea that people don't understand what we do. But also it's partially our fault because we can't define it very well. So when people have question about what we do and we try to talk about it versus another field, what is data-driven about what we do, what is not data-driven, we don't tend to be able to talk about the work that we do as data workers. So for some of us, it's the answer, data is the answer. For some of us, data is the problem. Sometimes people want to avoid it at all costs. They want to use any kind of language or any kind of description of their task that doesn't use data. We want to use archive, we want to use exhibit, we want to use edition. You know, there's all these sort of terms that are kind of interchangeable. We've had lots of debates about this because some of those terms are more familiar and they preserve nuance, so we say, or they undermine perceived ideologies and authorities of all kinds, which is something that ChatGPT even knows that we do. So people will come in to a center, to a consultation, or to a conference like this and sort of say, oh, you know, this is a simple misunderstanding. You know, you don't understand that this is just evidence. Let me teach you about all of the naming conventions and file structure hierarchies and version control. Just use these best practices. You can do it. You can do it. It's easy. Come, welcome. You know, be part of our team. And then the humanist who's more traditional or who has the kind of traditional hat, or the ChatGPT model of the humanist will say, but what do you mean by data? What do you mean? What does that word mean? Does it mean all of it? Is it plural? These are just my research materials. What do you mean by practices? What does this mean? What does this word practices? And then we'll say, well, let's just tidy this up a little bit. Let's just kind of look at this in a different light, from a different perspective, and see if we can tell a story with it. You know, data sets can tell stories, and data sets underpin so much of the modern narratives that we have in news media and all these other places. And then we'll be talking and trying and giving all the best practices and giving all the names for things that we know work and are standardized among us. And then maybe we will hear somebody say, but couldn't we just build a website? I just need a visualization for my book's website. Could you just build me a website? Okay, so what is the data that you want me to put on your visualization or in your visualization? Well, it's, you know, it's right here. Okay, so your evidence is your data. Right? This is data. What? No, it's the incredibly important cultural material I've discovered in an archive that an archivist put there in a catalog or usefully cataloged, and I have found it. And I'm basing my arguments on this original discovery that I found because there was a finding aid that somebody very usefully wrote for me. Okay, so what data are you going to use then? Data? What data am I going to use? I want you to help me with the visualization. That's what I'm talking to you about, right? Okay, so we're all very tired of this, aren't we? We're a little bit tired. I'm exaggerating a little, but like, why do we do this? This is so exhausting. And sometimes I think we do just say no. Like if they can't show us the data, if they walk in and they say, I want a website, or I'm so excited about the digital humanities, this is what I want my website to look like. We can just say no, I'm sorry, this is a field. Susan Schreiber wrote some really great things about this, like 20 years ago. You should read them. Like, you should read these things. This is a discipline. Take this seriously and then come back when you've educated yourself. But we don't always do that, do we? There's still something kind of like welcoming and open arms and pedagogical about this community, and I wonder if we could be a little meaner sometimes and just kind of say, no, we're not going to do it. So I'm tired of these kinds of conversations. I'm also tired because I write books, and I like books. I like writing them, but in the US, books are valued more than any other scholarly outputs, and that's part of the reason we have these conversations, because we don't always take one book and say, read this book, you're going to understand what DH is, you're going to understand what data in the humanities is, then you're going to know what it is, right? We don't have the kind of one book, because we are constantly iterating and changing, right? And that's part of why we are humanists, because there is nuance and change. So, I like them. In the US, books are more valued than many other scholarly outputs as the highest form of knowledge production, and I get that, and they are a perfect technology, and books are great. Peer review in the humanities is strained. University publishers in the humanities face untenable business models. We have not been able to make our peer reviewing labor visible or valuable. So even though books are important, the book I wrote is actually about the collaboratively built database with my colleagues, Megan Wilson, Rebecca Kozer, Mary Naden, Nick Budak, a number of collaborators, new work by Laurie Thompson, Wouter Haverhals. All these people are part of the book, but I have to write a single author monograph, because that's the other problem with our digital humanities guides and books, is that they're collaboratively written because we are living our values. Those are not valued as much. So working with a team to learn how to build a database, or even just how to see my materials as data, taught me that I didn't think our current concept of the humanities could survive if we're training students just to write single author monographs, instead of training them to think through arguments that are just as complex as what we might find in a monograph, but that occur in a variety of media formats that we are not trained to read, understand, or argue about as humanists. So my work with the PPA, the Princeton Prosody Archive, led me directly to founding the Center for Digital Humanities, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary this coming year. It would not have been possible without the labor of this group, especially Natasha Ermolayev. And the institutional impact of that center is the thing I wish I could say when people say, what is data in the humanities? I wish I could just say, the workflows that we built in this center, this is the thing, this is the intellectual impact, this is the value. So don't get me wrong, I like books, and in a minute I will talk a bit about connecting how we think about books to how we think about data, but I feel frustrated. I feel worked up, right? That we're still 2 decades, 3 decades, for some people 40 years into this project, and we still line up behind the book instead of all the other modes of knowledge production that made the research in the book possible. So, one of the things that I think we need to think about is our relationship to the book. The other thing I think we need to think a little bit about is how we talk about our relationship to the book. And there's emotion around that that I think we need to foreground in these conversations. So if somebody's walking in, I need a website for my book, well, let's step back for a second. Let's think about what that means. One strand in Poetry's data argues that in our technologically mediated research environment, our old models of the autonomous single scholar no longer hold. We have to acknowledge the embeddedness of our critical sources and research materials inside multiple layers of mediation, and our own situatedness in an ecosystem that demands collaboration and collectivity and interdisciplinarity. So to go back to Thomas' image of the person in the room in an unmediated knowledge-producing state, even just the book, we can get a lot of these models, and I know you know this already from book history and from the sort of media studies, materiality world that helps us understand how books don't just happen, or from critical archival studies. So I sneak this argument in by way of poems, a stealth data argument in a poetry book, or a stealth poetry argument in a data book. You decide, spring 2025. So prosody, the historical study of pronunciation and versification, get ready, it's really getting much, much warmer in this room, everybody downstairs, is famously difficult to taxonomize. Linguists have developed ways of talking about it in present speech, but we have few ways of thinking about the historical development of sound in literary studies. And the marks for meter are traces of both how historical poems might have sounded, as well as prescriptions to readers about how poems and how language should sound. So these marks are unreadable, and that can tell us something about our willingness to suspend multiple levels of mediation in order to read for poetic content rather than poetic form, all while we obsessively argue over how sounds might constitute poetic forms, and that is sound in the abstract. So I could go on and on about the ways we choose to read poems as choosing a path through multiple possible hierarchical relationships amid these various structures, but I won't. Instead, what I want to point out is that these marks are kind of a bespoke taxonomy, or even more abstract, a kind of technology that we might want to think about as bespoke or individual. They're unclear, not in any way a controlled vocabulary, but we still try to interpret them because they resemble things we understand just enough. Stress or accent, beat, we can call it a lot of different things. You yourself might be trying to read it and think, oh, this is really helpful. I wish I had had a guide like this when I was learning how to pronounce words, this, that, or the other. It's not that it isn't helpful, it's that it isn't standard. These are unclear, but to the author who wrote them, in this case, Joshua Steele, he was hoping everyone would use this system, this one, and then everyone else would understand a poem's rhythm, and it would become clear how to interpret the poem, how to feel something when you read the poem the proper way. So it's hard to translate how something sounded in the past. Poems have data, by which I mean that you can measure, but since no one agrees about how to measure them, mostly poems have abstractions, or poetic interpretation has abstractions that allow for a whole bunch of subjective interpretations. So now I'm going to speak really quickly, and for those of you who don't really want to know about poetic form in English, it would be a good time to check your email or text your friend. So just really quickly to talk about those abstractions, the legacy in the 19th century of a nation's greatness in its highest form, and poetry is the highest achievement of language. They say things like, for poetry, the idea is everything, the rest is a world of illusion, of divine illusion. Poetry attaches its emotion to the idea is fact. The strongest part of our religion today is its unconscious poetry. This is Matthew Arnold in 1880, which is why education is the key to civilization. So you see poetry is very important as an abstraction, not a lot of nuance there. And this continues and then gets even more institutionalized. This will be familiar to those of you in English literary study, new criticism, and the kinds of ways that people talk about poetry now. We have legacy of poetry as intersubjective transcendentalism, a way of reaching for a poem in writing or reading that is just out of reach in the hope that the poem will tell you who you are or help you in some emotional way. So Alan Grossman writes in 1990, and this is the kind of stuff I read all the time: the poem is the destiny of the reader. The reader is the destiny of a poem. So if this is the kind of work, and not to make fun of it, it's useful work. It's kind of a secular religious mode of thinking about poetry. If you're saying, but it has data, you can see how they would get worked up about that, right? Or Ben Lerner, who says poetry arises from the desire to get beyond the finite and the historical, the human world of violence and difference, and to reach the transcendental or the divine. This is humanities, right? But imagine somebody saying that, not about the abstraction of poetry, but about any other media format. Poetry has a weird, special place where it gets to do all this transcendental divine stuff, right? A hieroglyph maybe doesn't have that feeling. Maybe it does. In some cases, it probably does. But the way we talk about this, right? So these abstractions are everywhere, and I like to call this the poetry is magic function. Kind of like the little icon that my colleague Mary has noticed that springs up to accompany the new AI tools, the sort of like, ta-da, right? And I'm not saying that poetry isn't magical, it is. But the black box function of it, the fact that maybe we couldn't break it down to its component parts, or that it's a complicated puzzle that we learn about in school as being really hard, and you have to work really hard to understand it, but that maybe there is an answer if you work hard enough. Meditate on it and be transported. I'm really interested in that, and I love poems, but I'm interested in that in direct tension with this legacy of people arguing about how they work, about what we do when we interpret poems, what the pieces and parts are. So to zoom up and out a bit, and I'm almost done with this section for those of you checking your email, just a little warning. The sounds that are in poems are one part of what we might read as a poem's data, but we don't really want to talk about poetry's data in the concrete, at least literary scholars, and I'm being really, really wide stroke, paintbrushy here, so those of you who are like, no, but I kind of do, like, fine, that's cool, we can talk. That would make it too positivist, though, if you were like, this is how the poem works, this is why you think it's magic, because then it's not magic, right? So to keep poetry as a special experience individually, and for it to have power in culture as particularly difficult to understand, but for it also to be effective as a kind of transcendental divine, when you do understand it, you have to mystify the process. You have to understand just enough, but not all of it, or else it's not going to be able to work its magic. So I'm hinting here, okay, come back, emailers, at how a poem's technology, the sort of interface of those scansion marks, to me, makes really visible the weirdness of the concept of that abstraction. So what a poem means and how it means is clearly historically situated. And so are the technologies and material formats and circulation networks and labor and market conditions of the books and the newspapers and the periodicals that they travel in, but now these books have been scanned by libraries with the help of corporations that used metronomes, actual metronomes. I said corporations and they're like, I'm right here. They used metronomes to see how quickly they could scan the books. I love that, it's so metrical. or they're transferred from microfiche in the case of Gale, and now they own the copyrights to these images and the text data, and we buy the electronic copies of the cultural materials, and oh man, that OCR software can't read those marks. And I'm really interested in those marks. Okay, cool. So what am I gonna do? Okay, I'm gonna just find the guy who made a bibliography of all the people who thought and argued about how the versification and pronunciation that made up a poem or its data could lead to the right system of reading poems, and that's how I'm gonna study the history of poetry's data. I'll find that guy, and then I'll just use all his records to track down all the sources, and I'll just scan the books myself, even though his third wife burned some of them in a fit of pique. No problem. That's what I'm gonna do. Oh, wait. My library doesn't really want to help me buy those books. Doesn't really want to help me with that because I'm a junior professor. I don't have a lot of power. I can't really justify it. Plus, they have a lot of the books. Okay, well then I'll just download a bunch of stuff that seems kind of similar from the ProQuest website, you know, because we have this like subscription thing. And my librarian wrote to me and was like, "We have this for a couple days." This is like 2007, and I'll, you know, print it, and then I can just, you know, rescan the images, right? And then they'll be mine. I put in here audible gasp. Oh, okay, I can't do that, illegal. Okay, got it. Okay, so I'll ask ProQuest if they'll just give me all those images, because like who cares about the history of pronunciation and versification, right? Not that many people, so I put them in the 3-ring binder, just these couple of 100 pages. They'll definitely gonna let me do that, right? No, yeah, no, they're like, what, no, no, we're not gonna do that, absolutely not, okay. All right, so now I'm just gonna figure out, oh, this is cool, this thing called Zotero that's just been invented, I really like it, let's try that. Maybe that will help me build something that looks kind of like JSTOR. So now I'm the person, you get it, like I'm the person who walked in, right? And it's kind of like, oh yeah, this thing is great, I'm gonna do that, I'm gonna use this and make the thing that's like, oh, somebody else made the thing. Okay, cool, I'll just use that thing that they made, perfect, now it's 2012 and I've got the approval to start this center because I've been like trying to figure out how to make a database. Excellent. So if you want to learn more about this whole workflow, by the way, and like how we developed the PPA, specifically, you should head to the Literary Collections panel on Thursday at 2 p.m. for the full story. This is just the small story. But just to say, all of this, poetry's data, is also the story of me being incredibly naive. And I'm trying to tell it in a way that people can understand is normal. That worked up feeling of being naive and excited is also kind of part of this process, and we have to sort of figure out how to both harness that, but not honor it so much that we let people go through this, because this is not a workflow. This is not a workflow, you guys. This is really not a workflow. So I really thought, you know, how do I navigate this research environment circa 2007 to 2012? So it's the story of digital humanities in a way over the last 20 years. And I think we have to reckon with that as sometimes a story of what not to do, but not repeat it, right? My cautionary tale ended up making me really worked up. It should not have been that hard, and that's part of the reason that the Center for Digital Humanities was born, because I thought, you know, we shouldn't be doing this. It shouldn't be this hard. We have every reason to be worked up about this kind of basic information literacy, but it is not part of graduate education. We haven't prioritized it broadly, and these steps are kind of the main topic of our research, right? This is part of our evolving process at the CDH, what we now call chartering. Like, how are we gonna let you navigate the information environment just enough, and then we'll figure out with you how to make an actual viable research project. And this is one of the many workflows that I urge you to listen to Mary Naden and Jerry Waringa talk about tomorrow at the RSE Digital Turn in Humanities at 11:32, right? So we added in our websites lots of editorial essays about the design. We went to conferences and presented posters. We pitched a book about how doing research in walled gardens was really frustrating. Literary Collections, 2 p.m. tomorrow also. But it didn't matter. I had to write poetry's data. I had to write a whole book, in order to foreground the importance of the data work that undergirded the PPA, which is the same kind of data work that goes into all of these other collections too, because tenure and review committees in the USA at least do not know how to evaluate scholar-built digital projects. And we also don't know how to advocate for their value. Scholars are really good at imagining what they want websites to look like. Right around the time of COVID, we were talking at the CDH on Slack about how difficult it was for people to understand that we were researchers and that our outputs were scholarship. Because of our location in the library, our CDH was often mistaken for a digital scholarly services unit, and part of the reason was that faculty kept coming in and asking for websites. They were good at describing how their websites would work, or should look, but not good at describing the data that might go into those websites. Even when we could get people to describe a research question, it was difficult to get them to see their research as data. They really didn't want to do it. And I'm sure we've all been in some version of this conversation. Moving away from this encounter now is really frustrating. How do we do it? Because if we say no, are they going to not help us hire another person in our unit? Are they going to say that this isn't scholarship? There's so much people don't know about all the work, and we are so tired of explaining it and re-explaining it, what the work is. And there's this deep suspicion that if you call the research materials data, what Miriam Posner has now called data trouble, what it will cause is an unwillingness to move forward with the project. Because to be honest, it is easier to just pretend that you're by yourself in a room. It is easier to encounter that poem and describe how it has that feeling for you, and then talk about how that interpretation matters, and that's what's valued. There's so much baggage attached to the term data. Miriam Posner says that it has associations that make it incompatible with established ways humanities scholarship understands itself. We can see that. We can metabolize that there are different ways of seeing the world. We can do that. But the suspicion of data in humanities also feeds into the myth that the humanities scholar both doesn't need to understand how their research materials are already data, and how their refusal to see them as such undermines the data work that we do, and of the people who made those materials accessible to them to begin with, findable, accessible, or even who made the book. So I have no patience for that. I would like us to start using a new phrase, performative helplessness. I have no patience for performative helplessness around any kind of technology, especially not in the service of some concept of specialized non-mediated knowledge, especially in the service of something that makes it seem like that work was not mediated by a lot of other unnamed and invisible data workers. There is no such thing. Performative helplessness, just put that in your back pocket. If you see it, you don't have to call them out, but you can just think, oh, that's what it is. Do you already know this? Is this a term somebody else has used? Yeah. Not really? Yes? Yeah. You have? Okay, I want the citation, because I was like, this is the thing. This is what it is. I don't know how to do, could you do technology? I don't know. I'm so busy writing my book. I'm sorry, could you just fix this for me? Yeah, no, I can't. Learn how to fix it. I'm sorry, it's 2024. Worked up. I'm simplifying here, but I'm breaking up the two sides of work and flow a little bit. My hypothesis is that we have to have an understanding, everyone has to have an understanding of what the work is, what our terms are, what our questions are, before we can enter in to what we like to think of as a more flow-like state in which we can meaningfully collaborate and build new knowledge together. So this can be really painful for people. We like to have mastery, we like to be comfortable, we like to take the easy path and the one that's rewarded, and our ways of knowing are what make us experts, and looking at something from another perspective can be uncomfortable, but it can also be revelatory. Those of you who have children know this, those of you who have partners know this, those of you who have friends know this. This is the first part of what I mean when I say worked up about data. It's all these feelings, we really have to think about them. Because if those people walk in and they perform that performative helplessness, we can just say no, as you should, with people who don't give you much in the relationship. The assumptions in these instances is that data is the underlying work that someone else should do. But where I would like to get to is the place where we're able to talk about a number of different possible kinds of data work, practices, data communities, and we're getting there much faster than I thought, and then value those contributions as scholarship. So data work allowed me to understand how much I had to learn about the history of poetry in relation to the broader history of linguistics and literary studies. Working with the researchers at the CDH in particular showed me how challenging this work is for everyone, for beginners and for experts. It's not that it goes away once you know how to fix the computer, once you're not helpless, right? So how do we come to an agreement about data workflows if we don't have a culture in which we discuss and theorize our research practices, our assumptions about scholarship and research and writing as humanists? How can we imagine honoring the interpretive labor of data work when people seem so worked up about even calling their source materials data to begin with? So Zoe and I set out to ask scholars in a variety of humanities institutions broadly, and it's not exhaustive and we're not finished, how they began to work with data, what their concept of data work entails, and what they had by way of institutional training or guidance on methods and standards in their various fields. We spoke with scholars in several departments, as well as librarians, folks in information science, computer science departments, and we're in the process of scheduling several more interviews. And if you want to be interviewed, if you have strong thoughts, if you're worked up about data, please contact me, let me know. Super excited about that, as you can tell. Data work in the humanities started in our random channel, also in Slack, and it started because of a workflow that we have in place to move any substantive conversation off of Slack and into a Google Doc so that we don't lose track of it. Rebecca Munson, our dear, dear colleague who we miss very much, was our documentation queen, and she would be very proud of our new documentation queen, Mary Naden. My theory is, and this is from the Google Doc, when we standardize or when a critical mass accepts a standard for data work, for humanities data, then the data is perceived as not as complex or as having been rendered less complex or as flattened and then somehow dehumanized. And then it moves into another disciplinary realm, and people aren't interested in being interdisciplinary in that way. Then it goes into the someone else should do it. But when we individualize our data standards, even project by project, we keep the aura of complexity and specialness that scholars really like. And I think it's a real tension in the field, how much we allow that and not allow it. So that'll be part of what we're trying to work out in this handbook. Zoe and I sprinted for several months on a proposal. We got really useful reviews. And then we started our interviews. And notice I'm really naive here. It wouldn't be terribly hard. Okay, 2 years later. So for data work in the humanities, we really wanted to think about the workflows that we might generalize, but also what we found was that there were so many different responses to the question of even what data work is and what it means, that the best we might do was to just venture some suggestions or some meditations. So for the rest of my time, I'm going to just let people who are much smarter than I am not do the talking, but I'm going to just sort of give you a couple of the slides. This was from our proposal. Data work aims to empower humanists and data scientists alike to dwell in the transformative possibilities of theorizing interpretation before tabulation. It was originally going to be called tabulation and its discontents. Not only what counts as data in the humanities or how we might treat material or non-material objects of humanistic study as data, but how we might bring more intention to our data practices through a deeper understanding of interpretation earlier in our process. I mean, DH already took the data turn, or at least the kind of DH that we practice, so I'm not going to go into that. The kind of DH I'm interested in combines critical data studies and critical archival studies already, and it's so wonderful to be in a room of people who know what I'm talking about and are just like, yes, we're on the same page, right? So this from 2017, for a source to be data, it must be made computationally tractable. By tractable, we mean, following Willard McCarty, that information can be read, manipulated, and programmatically transformed by a computer or by computer-like operations. Computability is often accomplished by categorization, and these two qualities, categorization and computability, distinguish data sets proper from the sources that media scholars are more commonly analyze and interpret. And of course, in this, however many, 7, 8 years since this was published, we now analyze data sets too. We analyze and interpret data sets. We think really meaningfully and critically about categorization, which Joanna Drucker had already kind of thought about as parametrization early on. And now, of course, our entire concept of computability has changed and is different. Oh, and we finished the last interview right before ChatGPT, the last interview we did before I had to pause to write Poetry's data, right before ChatGPT was released. So we have 25 interviews that are like a time capsule of what people did for data work pre. So now we're like, oh man, I gotta go back. Now what do you think? Would you change any of your questions, right? So thinking about that is important. Oh, the other date that I forgot to say is that Ted Underwood's post that was Ted Underwood's essay, which was so important to me too, theorizing research practices we forgot to theorize 20 years ago, is now 10 years old. I know. We're tired, right? Okay, Lauren Klein. If I had to define data work as a narrower subset of the work that I do, and watch what happens in this, I would have to describe narrower all of the things that happen in the process of preparing data for use, right? So this includes identifying, if you're starting from primary or archival sources, what those materials are, not just which ones should I pick, but what makes sense for the questions I want to ask. Then, who has them and what form are they in? How much do they cost to get the rights? Are they machine readable or not? All this stuff. And then once you get them, what do they actually look like? And are they useful for this type of analysis? Is there metadata that needs to be overlaid? How big are they and where do they go? Who needs to access them? I mean, there's a lot of stuff. Data work is, at least in terms of the time, almost all of the work. By the time you actually get to be doing the analysis part of things, you've usually done almost everything, and yet all of the things that I just described are not really clearly defined as things that matter, or at least are counted, especially in the humanities, which is why this conference is so important. Such a great theme. It's one of those things where, in order, I think, for at least one branch of DH, or the kind of computational literary analysis branch, or the results branch, we've had to do the thing where we play the monograph game by foregrounding the impact or the argument. And then the data work is the appendix, or is the attachment, or is in Zenodo with a little bit of an essay on it. I understand that because we're trying to be quantitative social sciences, but I think we need to flip it and make quantitative social sciences talk about this work too, because it's just as interpretive for them, and that's one of the things I think we can bring as folks who do this work and know how to value it. Catherine Bode says, I think about the practice that I do in order to write. I think of it as a type of writing that goes on in order to do the writing that becomes the literary scholarship. I think I've thought about it in different ways over the time I've been doing it. So I think I started off thinking about it like cleaning, like putting things in order. I love that.